Now, the bail came with strict monitoring conditions, however, including wearing an electronic monitoring device, staying at a registered address, checking in with London police daily, and observing curfews. However, that doesn't mean that Assange is leaving prison anytime soon. He's going to remain in custody pending an appeal of the ruling by Swedish prosecutors, bringing up questions as to yesterday's news that a secret grand jury had been assembled in Virginia to consider what charges could be brought against him here in the U.S. and whether Sweden might hand him over. So legally, could it happen? Does the U.S. really have a case against Assange? Well, here to discuss it with me is attorney Michael Barnes, policy advisor at DCBA Law and Policy. Michael, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Let's get down to the basics. From as far as I understand, what the U.S. is really trying to use against Assange here is the Espionage Act. But do they really have a case?
There's a strong case for criminal behavior on the part of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, because the elements that the prosecutors in the U.S. will look to is whether Assange disseminated information related to the national defense of the United States with the knowledge that that dissemination would harm the national defense.
Correct me if I'm wrong there, but doesn't that sound like what our media does all the time, what the New York Times has been doing, what the Guardian's been doing, by also disseminating these leaks that WikiLeaks gave them?
Well, that's a good question, and that's ultimately what I think down the road, after probably years of litigation and legal processes, we will get to the major question as to what is journalism in the age of the internet, and how far do the U.S. freedoms of speech and the freedom of press really go?
Well, and Julian Assange, not to mention, also is not an American citizen. So how is he necessarily, you know, a lot of people have been calling this treason, what he's done to America. But can we really go after a guy who's Australian, who happens to run a website that also is located internationally, that happens to give documents to our media?
You are pointing out all the questions that for lawyers are very exciting right now, because all of this is related to jurisdiction in an information age where we've got acts that likely occurred in the U.S. or in networks that could be deemed to have been located in the United States, and then also the involvement of U.S. military personnel, and the fact that we make our laws and we determine when jurisdiction exists under our laws. We will, of course, need to look to the laws of the nation from which we're seeking extradition of Julian Assange, make sure that there's also a comparable law that would have been broken in order for them to be willing to hand him over to the U.S.
I understand that this might be exciting for people like you, right? For lawyers all over the country. But for me, for someone like myself who is a journalist, I find this scary. I think that this could set a very dangerous precedent. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the Espionage Act has never been used successfully against a media organization.
Yes, and that's why you really shouldn't be concerned, because as a journalist, you abide by ethics, and you're not an agitator that is intent on harming the U.S. government. And there's a very strong case that WikiLeaks and Julian Assange are not journalists. And in fact, now they're attempting to sell themselves as journalists. But it's more of an effort now to create a defense for legal purposes. But there have been admissions on the part of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks that indeed they saw as collateral damage the harm that could occur to informants for the U.S., for example. So this is willingness to disseminate information related to our national defense that will cause harm.
Well, according to our government, anything might cause harm to our national defense. The slightest little secret that gets out there, that's why I think a lot of people have to start questioning this. But tell me, I've also heard that there's another thing, rumors that they might go for a conspiracy charge under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act if they find evidence that he actually incited someone to give over this information.
Right.
Do they have any of that evidence?
I don't know specifically whether they have any of that evidence. As you know, the prosecutors in the U.S. have been very secretive, and that's why we hear that there might be a secret grand jury in Alexandria, Virginia. But I do think that it would make sense to avoid the First Amendment questions if we want to deal swiftly with the threats caused by WikiLeaks. And all the states in the U.S., many of the states, I won't say all, I don't know for certain, have computer crimes acts, and so does the U.S. federal government. So that would be an opportunity for prosecutors to pursue.
Now, this secret grand jury that may or may not have been held yesterday, but well, I'm just going to go ahead and assume that it was held yesterday. Is that normal? That they'll get together and they'll just try to rack their brains and come up with any little thing that they can do to get someone in the country? The
prosecutors would actually be presenting information, and then the grand jury would be determined whether there is enough evidence to bring them into the country and to request extradition. But we have to remember that that information came out from the attorneys, the defense attorneys for WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, and they're in heavy fundraising mode.
Do you think that there's any chance that Sweden might actually now allow the U.S. or, extradite Julian Assange to the U.S., might defer all of their charges against him?
Certainly there are a lot of conspiracy theories that these charges are indeed intended to allow the U.S. to get their hands on Julian Assange. I do think that it is possible, after years of legal wrangling, that Sweden could turn him over. It probably would be easier for the U.S. to pursue extradition of Julian Assange from Great Britain, because we've got that special long-standing legal relationship and political relationship with Britain, but also we have a new law that permits a more expedited extradition post 9/11.
Yeah, something that the Brits have often complained about. But what do you think the chances are that the Brits would actually allow the extradition to happen? I mean, when it comes to freedom of the press, you could say that these people they give a lot more leeway than we do here in America.
I wouldn't go that far to say that myself, but I can say that it's going to be a long and drawn-out process, and it's going to be just as politicized there as it is here, and probably more so. And so we want to make sure that the sovereignty of those nations is not called into question. No one wants to be deemed a pet or a puppet of the U.S. government, and that's going to be a really, really important element from the perspective of whichever country is considering an extradition request from the United States.
Do you find it at all surprising that the Obama administration, the administration that promised the most open and transparent administration of all time, is actually more actively pursuing whistleblowers than even George Bush?
Well, actually, I don't think that the Obama administration is moving as swiftly as some Democrats have actually been calling for the administration to move. So, for example, we saw U.S. Senator Dianne Feinstein, who's the chairwoman of the Senate Committee on Intelligence. She's been calling for these charges to be brought by the U.S. Justice Department. And we saw Hillary Clinton with a really strong response related to the State Department information that was leaked. But we haven't heard anything from President Obama. That's probably a smart political move. Defense Secretary Robert Gates has actually been somewhat counterproductive in terms of saying, oh, there wasn't damage caused to the United States, and now backpedaling and saying, yeah, there probably will be or was damage to the United States. And that's likely because the Justice Department called him up and said, hey, you could be ruining our case.
Oops. All right. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
We'll just have to wait and see, obviously, what happens here.
It's going to be fascinating.